Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott, the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today we'll be talking with Dr. Victor Vogel about something that affects you, me, and every other pilot alive, and that's aging. If we're lucky, we continue to get older, but there are challenges associated with getting older, and we'll talk about how to navigate the skies of aging and the challenges of growing older. And so that you don't miss next week's episode in whatever app you're listening to us now, take a moment now and touch the subscribe or follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Last week in episode 255, we talked with pilot examiner and math professor Dr. Catherine Cavagnaro about using math to help you fly more safely. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/256. And this is a listener-supported show, and we're still ad-free. And I'm sure when you go out to dinner, you, of course, tip your servers. And some people tip their podcast host. So if you've ever learned anything helpful from listening to this show, please sign up to become a member, join the club, and support the show financially at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. Now let me tell you a little about Victor Vogel. He's a board-certified medical oncologist who was a medical school professor for 25 years, where he did clinical research in breast cancer treatment and prevention. He's been flying for more than 40 years, and he's a CFI and II, and a member of the board of directors of the National Association of Flight Instructors. 2 years ago, he founded a public charity called Susquehanna STEM to the Skies that seeks to bring aviation-based STEM education to the high schools and career technical centers in the Susquehanna Valley of South Central Pennsylvania. And now here's our conversation with Dr. Victor Vogel. Victor, welcome back to the show. It's so great to have you here again.
Max, it's great to be back with you.
We're going to be talking about aging pilots, but first let's talk about pilot demographics a little bit. What's the average age of a pilot? How many pilots are over age 60? Kind of scale this for us.
Well, let me start by an adage, Max. The old adage is that you don't stop flying when you get old. You get old when you stop flying. So that's kind of what our focus is going to be today. But to answer your question, the average age of the pilot population over the last 40 years or so has increased. And it got up to a high of almost 46 years, and now it's back to 44 years. But even 44 years means we're an aging population. And it turns out that there's about 23%, almost a quarter of the pilots are 60 years of age or older. And that accounts for more than 153,000 pilots. And when I first saw that number, I was somewhat surprised. And even among the octogenarians, there's more than 9,000 registered pilots who are 80 years of age and older. So that's really rather remarkable. But it's also important to recognize that in 1900, 122 years ago, the average person only lived to be about 50 years of age. And now the average person, the women, they're a little stronger than we are. They live to their mid to late 80s. And we men make it to our late 70s and early 80s on average. So that means there's a huge number of people who live well into their mid to late 70s or even their 80s. And it's likely that number and the proportion of people in those older age groups are going to continue to increase as time goes on. And that's due to things like better nutrition, better healthcare maintenance, immunizations, all sorts of things that have improved our health over the years. So this notion of all of us getting older, but particularly pilots getting older, is going to continue as time goes on. It's also interesting that in terms of the proportional growth in the last 4 or 5 years, in terms of the demographic groups that are increasing the most in the pilot population, the largest increase in terms of demographics is people 70 and older. So even though there are many more pilots in the 14 to 50 age group, we older people are increasing our demographic group at a greater rate than the others. So this problem or this challenge of the aging pilot is going to continue for the foreseeable future.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Stanford study. Coincidentally, I had been part of, I think, that particular study about, 20 years ago, just as I was starting to become a CFI, and they had a simulator that was being used at Stanford, and I got paid to do that one time as they were testing my instrument abilities. Tell us about the long-range study they did.
Yeah, it was a fascinating study done at Stanford University by a group of investigators who were interested in changes over time. Now, they had a relatively short period of time. They observed pilots in general aviation simulator over about a 3-year period, and they did annual testing on 118 pilots. And these pilots were solidly middle-aged. They were between the ages of 40 and 69 years. And the investigators evaluated the pilots with performance scores, and they assessed the pilot's ability to follow and execute air traffic control instructions, how well they did an instrument scan, could they avoid traffic that was in the simulation, how did they do in an approach to landing, and then they got an overall score. And it was somewhat fascinating and very instructive to learn that in general, the older pilots who had a low total flight time, low total number of flight hours, and low recent time did in general worse than the younger pilots who had similar experience. But older pilots who had high total time and more recent flight time did as well or better than the younger students. So what the investigators concluded was that while there was a mild decrease in overall flight performance with age, it could be offset by varying degrees of expertise and good health. So not surprisingly, healthier people do better than people who aren't healthy. And the investigators went on to say that, well, there was great advantage of prior experience and especially specialized expertise, so that the more experience you had in a particular kind of airplane or kind of environment, it improved your cognitive skill performance. And the more expert a pilot was, assessed by how many recent hours and total hours they had, those pilots had less decline in their performance over the period of several years of observation. But somewhat surprising to me was that what seemed to decline most acutely and that was most evident was the ability to communicate. That is the radio phraseology and radio technique. And it was the thing that declined most sharply over time. I remember recently I went to a fly-in event at an airport some distance from my home. And after a 2.5 or 3 hour flight, we were doing instrument approaches. And there was an older pilot, and we know he was older because we met him on the ground and learned that he was older. And he was flying a twin, and he was having a very difficult time in following sequential directives from air traffic control. Like the airliners, they had us in a stacked holding pattern. Some people were at 6,000 feet, some were at 4, some were at 2, and we were all waiting our turn to get to this fly-in event. And this older pilot flying this twin had a very difficult time acknowledging, repeating accurately the ATC instructions. And at one point, he even turned in the wrong direction. He turned opposite to the directions that he was given by ATC. So these communication problems are real, and I've observed them firsthand. But if you're an older pilot who initially performs worse, that over time there's less decline in the flight summary scores, the assessments, than there are for the younger pilots. So what that tells us is that in general, experience offsets the negative effects of aging. And that's a very important thing. So I guess the vernacular way to say that is if you don't use it, you lose it. So that maintaining regular flying and maintaining hours and proficiency, which we're going to talk about, is very, very important as we age.
Yes, I think that's probably the key takeaway that I had from taking a look at these studies that you provided me. ahead of time. Certainly for communication issues, I see that quite frequently and hear it quite frequently. It's often the case that you can tell by someone's voice over the radio that they're getting up in years, and sometimes their communication skills are poor. But it was fascinating to see that that was documented as a common type of issue. One of the other outcomes of the study here said that older pilots are more likely to go ahead and land after an instrument approach to an airport with inadequate visibility. And that's exactly what I remember being tested on. One of the times the visibility was good and we were able to land. The next time, just at the very last moment, they threw the clouds in the way. And I think they were looking to see, would I continue to try and land or would I go around?
Yeah, and one of the things I worry about now with enhanced cockpit avionics is many of us now fly with synthetic vision. And I think synthetic vision is a mixed blessing. It sure is nice to have that picture digitally generated on the screen in front of you when you're in the clouds doing an approach. But my fear is that it sure is tempting, if you get to minimums and you don't see the runway through the clouds and through the windscreen, that you can say, well, I see it in the synthetic vision, and whether or not that's going to tempt us, particularly as we age and our vision is not as good as it used to be, whether it will be attempting to violate minimum altitudes and so forth. I sure hope that doesn't happen, but it's a concern that I have about the new technology.
I think that's a very valid point. And the thing that I'm concerned about with the newer technologies are just the complexity of using GPS navigators in general. If you think back to when you and I started flying years ago, we had VORs in the airplane. You could jump from one airplane to another. It could be a completely different manufacturer's VOR. You could still figure out how to use it. These days, the GPSs are so complex. If you don't know how to use a particular GPS in detail, you're certainly not going to be able to use a different manufacturer's GPS. But even so, even if you're flying with only one GPS, it's kind of like Microsoft Word, where maybe we use 5% of the features. And if you don't use the other features frequently, it's pretty easy to get confused about them.
Well, and I myself know that as an older pilot, that if I don't fly for 2 or 3 weeks, I can notice a decline in my proficiency. And sometimes what I refer to as the buttonology, on which buttons do I push to do which tasks, that can kind of take a moment to come back. And the longer it has been since I've been in my technically advanced aircraft, the harder it is sometimes to remember, well, how do I do that thing? And we're going to talk about that later. But this maintaining currency is part of maintaining proficiency. And it is surprising to me how rapidly you can lose proficiency in our new modern technically advanced aircraft.
Yeah, I think we're probably already getting to kind of the first conclusion here, which is fly frequently. And as you age, it's possible you need to fly a bit more frequently than you did when you were younger.
Yeah, I think that's true. And the other thing is, I think the decline, it occurs more often and more rapidly in us older individuals than it does in younger folks. But even in younger pilots, you've seen it and I've seen it. If there's long gaps between flights, you do lose and you forget just how to do some things. So recency is very, very important.
Well, let's talk about physiological changes that occur with aging. Tell us about vision. Let's start there.
Yeah, so I'm always amused. I often fly with my wife, who has pretty good vision, and she is always pointing out the traffic long before I can see it. And thank goodness, I have ADS-B in and I can see the traffic on the scopes. But boy, seeing it visually is sometimes a challenge. And what we know is that as we get older, visual changes are some of the earliest and really the most notable things that we see, and what or that we don't see. And what happens is our peripheral vision, our vision to see things off to the sides of our visual fields, that starts to narrow. And so our peripheral vision becomes narrow in scope, more tunneled, and our near vision becomes much less acute. I wear contact lenses, but when I fly, I never wear contacts. and I fly with trifocals, the top lens sees distant, the middle lens sees the instruments, and the bifocal lens on the bottom is how I read things. And if I'm at home wearing my glasses and I have to read very small print, I have to take off my glasses to see things that are very small. And as we get older, our eyes no longer focus as quickly as they used to. So going from near vision to distant vision to come into focus takes a little longer. And the other thing that degrades as we age is night vision. And that's why we've all heard the adage that when you fly at night above 5,000 feet, that wearing supplemental oxygen probably helps a great deal. But these are all things that we should become aware of. And there's nothing wrong with, as we age and we fly with companions, particularly with companions that are older or younger and have better visual acuity, to put them to work and ask them to help us with things like spotting traffic and so forth, because there's definitely a decline with age. And then most authorities would recommend that we get eye exams every year. And some of that's important to check internal ocular pressures for diseases like glaucoma. That's important to do. And we mentioned oxygen. And if you fly at night, very important to allow your eyes to adjust. In my cockpit, I can reduce the brightness of my primary flight display and my moving map, but it takes 20 minutes or longer when you get in that cockpit and start dimming those lights for your eyes to adjust to night vision. And whatever it takes to help us see, whether it takes bifocals or, as I say, I wear trifocals because the middle lens really helps me to see the screens on my technically advanced panel, and that we wear sunglasses in bright sun to cut the haze. And as I mentioned, certainly if it's at all possible, have some sort of traffic alert equipment, some sort of ADS-B in for your iPad or into the panel that allows the recognition of where the traffic will appear. I often don't see it when the ADS-B calls it out, but at least I know where to look. So these are the kinds of things that we need to be aware of and need to consider doing and changing as we get older, because there will be changes in our acuity, no doubt.
Yeah, I want to highlight two things you talked about, and one was night and the other is ADS-B traffic. I've had a couple of night flights within the last couple of weeks, and I was coaching the pilot to dim the PFD, dim the moving map. And it's interesting, when you do it the first time, you may think, oh, okay, this is the right level, this is fine. But if you wait another 10, 15 minutes, what you're going to find is your eyes have now adjusted and you need to dim it even further.
Yes, I have found that, Max. Yes, that is absolutely true.
Yeah, so don't just dim it one time. And the difference in terms of what we could see outside the airplane was phenomenal. When we started, when things were too bright, could barely see anything outside. After 15, 20 minutes of dimming a couple of times, wow, we could actually see quite a bit outside.
And I've been surprised at just how dim I can make those panels and still see the panels very well. And as you say, the more dim I make the panels, the better is my, and part of that is the adaptation that occurs over time. But dimming those panels is very, very helpful. And it's something that we should remind ourselves to do. And I like your suggestion to do it several times. And I've done that myself 2 or 3 times to dim the panel progressively as my eyes adjust to the dark.
Yeah, that 20 minutes to get the eyes to adapt is real. Now, you also mentioned ADS-B. I think that certainly for people who live in metro areas, that's just essential. If you don't have some form of traffic in, you should get it. And I think it's interesting that you said your wife was spotting traffic faster than you were. I certainly find that younger people spot traffic usually faster than I do once they become experienced at looking for it. But I also found that a prescription change in my contacts made it easier for me to spot it at a little bit farther distance. Typically, it's hard for me to see traffic, a normal GA aircraft, much beyond 2 miles, unless there's a lot of contrast. I'll see it sometimes at 4 miles if it's a black dot on a white cloud. But yeah, you really need something to assist in spotting traffic in the metro areas in particular.
Yeah, my ADS-B screen, I have a screen on the side of my moving map that has a 2-mile ring and a 6-mile ring, and it makes me chuckle whenever the traffic comes up at the 6-mile ring. as well. First of all, it's very far away, and secondly, there is no way I'm ever going to see it at 6 miles. I'm fortunate to be able to see it at 2.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had pilots say to me, "Do you see that traffic at 5 miles?" And I tell them, "Hey, we're not going to see it till it gets a lot closer." So
Yeah.
anyway,
Amen.
it is kind of funny. Well, let's talk about hearing loss. We talked with Dr. Greg Van back in episode 187 about hearing, but tell us some more about it.
Well, the real offender here is that chronic noise, and that can be workplace noise or noise from hobbies, like things like shooting, or if you're a race car enthusiast, the chronic noise exposure is damaging to hearing. But the other thing that occurs with age is that we lose, as we get older, particularly high frequency. And there are some sad but true humorous cartoons about the couple at home trying to watch television and having to turn it up so that the elderly couple can hear. And I used to think those were humorous. Now I think those are kind of truth-telling, because both my wife and I have noticed that, our ability to hear is not what it used to be. In fact, when sometimes we have TV sets that will show subtitles, and you use subtitles for foreign language films, but sometimes we turn on the subtitles for the English language films because it makes it much easier to hear and understand. And in airplanes, cockpit exposure to noise over the years, and I've been flying for 40 years, 4 decades. And early on in my flying, we didn't have noise canceling headsets, and I wore earplugs and things that attempted to protect my hearing from that 85 to 90 decibel noise in the airplane. But chronic exposure to airplane cockpit noise without noise canceling headsets is also damaging. And we need to be aware that this will happen. And, I have pilots that I've taught. I remember a recent pilot who I was training for his commercial certificate, and he wore hearing aids on the ground, and he had really significantly impaired hearing. And he took his hearing aids out when he flew, but fortunately had very effective noise canceling headsets that he could turn up loud enough so that it canceled the ambient noise and enabled him to hear. And with those headsets on, our conversations were easy and straightforward. But at the end of the flight, when we were shutting everything down, he would, of course, turn off the avionics master switch. And before he got his hearing aids back into his ears, he could not hear me sitting next to him and speaking in a normal voice. So hearing loss with age is a very, very common problem. And we should never be embarrassed or afraid to ask air traffic control or other pilots in the traffic pattern to repeat their last transmission, and ask ATC to say again if necessary. And we should, as part of our annual physical exams, we should not only have our eyes checked and the pressures in our eyes checked and our acuity checked and our eyeglass prescriptions changed if necessary, but we should have our hearing checked. And if we need help with our hearing, we should certainly get that done, because you can imagine, I'm sure you well know, Max, there are many situations in flying where if you can't hear or be heard, it really degrades aviation safety. So we need to be aware of hearing loss as we get older and do whatever we need to make sure that we maintain our ability to hear.
I think I heard about a change in the law sometime in the past year that should make hearing aids more widely available at lower costs. So anybody who's thought about them in the past and thought they were too expensive should probably go back and check them out again.
Yeah, my understanding is that there are now very affordable, very effective hearing aids available. And I know there's some pride associated with not wanting to wear hearing aids, but the people who wear them and have done it for a long time just say that hearing well, it just improves interactions in many things that we do in life, not just flying. So yeah, it's important that we pay attention to that and get proper hearing aids if we need them.
Well, let's talk about fatigue, strength, and endurance. I've noticed sometimes that I'm surprised when I'll have a younger student pilot who can literally do 20 landings in a row, and then they're kind of done. Whereas older pilots, boy, they get to 8 or 9 landings practice and they're pretty fatigued.
Yeah, and the same thing is true about trip length and trip durations. When I was younger, I could fly a couple of legs, and the total flight duration might be 5-6 hours with 1 or 2 stops. And now, if I fly a 2 or 3 hour leg, I'm ready to stop and take a little rest to get rehydrated. It's important to recognize that, particularly after we pass about age 50, our endurance starts to decline. And one thing that particularly folks who are sedentary, and I was a sedentary physician for many, many years. I was in and out of exam rooms all day long, but most of my day was spent seated at a desk. And I had to remind myself to get regular exercise. And regular exercise can really help promote both strength, flexibility, and endurance. And we want to keep that in mind, that flying, you think, well, flying isn't very fatiguing because you're just sitting, but sitting and doing mental work is fatiguing. And so one of the things that we encourage pilots to do is to take shorter legs, make frequent stops, make sure they remain well hydrated, and fly earlier in the day, or in the early evening when flights can be made, when the sun goes down or is going down and the air is smoother and there's less traffic perhaps. But scheduling stops and rest periods and breaking up longer flights into shorter segments is very, very important. And the other thing, we want to maintain our eating. We don't, as we get older, we're more susceptible to low blood sugar, which is called hypoglycemia. And so we want to bring not only hydration in the cockpit, avoiding caffeine, because caffeine's a diuretic, and that can lead to some challenges in the cockpit, but light snacks and something to rehydrate us, very, very important. And I think if we do those things, we'll find out that our flying is a little better tolerated. And the other thing we have to be aware of is that as we get fatigued, that our proficiency, our ability to fly effectively and safely, starts to decline. So not only is it a comfort issue in terms of not feeling sleepy or tired or thirsty, but it's also a safety issue, that we remain well rested, well hydrated, and well fed when we fly.
Yeah, no question. We start to get goofy and make poor decisions if we haven't eaten in a long time, or if it's really late. I do a lot of longer trips, and I always bring food with me because I'm always concerned about, hey, I might miss lunch, I might miss dinner. It's just great having enough food with me that I'm, not feeling run down and unfed, if you will. And the other thing, over the years, I've come up with a personal minimum in terms of lateness in the day. I just don't fly past 11 p.m. I've read about too many accidents that have happened at 1 or 2 in the morning. I know even when I'm sitting at my home at 11 p.m. at night, hey, I'm not quite as sharp as I was a couple hours earlier. So I think that's important for people to have a personal minimum where they get themselves out of the sky at some hour of the night, because it just doesn't make sense to continue to drone on at all hours. You get tired and you make mistakes.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And there were studies done years ago in medical house officers, interns, and residents in the hospital. And to make a very long story short, sleep deprivation led to mistakes in medical professionals. And we can bring that knowledge into the cockpit and know that flying late, and particularly flying after a long day's work. And again, mental work is just as fatiguing for many people as is physical work. And to fly at the end of a long day and then to fly late into the evening and in the dark, really probably not a good idea for any pilot, but particularly for a pilot who's older, for whom fatigue may be a bigger problem flying under those circumstances than for a younger pilot.
Yeah, I think a lot of us like to remember our 30s and think that we're still Superman, but that's not the case. All of us start to slow down. Well, let's talk about memory. How does that change with age?
Again, getting older is either distressing or it's very amusing. My wife and I get amused as we watch each other walk around the house, walk into a room and say, now, why did I come in here? Or looking for, you name it, the pen, the phone, the iPad. Our memory tends to decline as we get older. And the working memory that we use often in flying is the type that's most affected by aging. Just getting the job done is what working memory does. And so, I used to be able to remember frequencies and transponder codes and altitudes without writing them down. And now I write everything down. Or if I'm flying with someone and they're willing, they can write down things like new frequencies and altitudes and names of intersections on instrument clearances. So it's more important as we get older to take notes and to use whatever reminders there are in our aircraft for things like headings and altitudes. Many of the newer technically advanced aircraft have things like altitude pre-selects or heading bugs, and they have places, the way they store radio frequencies and so forth. But even with all of that, I think it's a reasonable thing to write things down, because I'm very often impressed at how short my short-term memory can be. And as we get older, many older pilots report that they have trouble remembering things like altitude assignments, transponder codes, radio frequencies, all the things that we commonly use in flying. So we have to use these little tricks like writing down those things. Or we also notice that if you fly, as we spoke a moment ago, late in the day, after a long day of work, when you're tired, your ability to remember those things, even short term, is impaired with fatigue. And you can use cockpit companions, people who fly with you, and ask them to remember that transponder code or remember that new frequency or help you out with the altitude assignment. Was it 4,000 or 4,000? Was it 6,000? Was that heading 330 or 310? And many people that we fly with are glad to be put to work and feel that they can help. And we shouldn't feel that shows that we're somewhat less effective as a pilot. I would argue that asking for those kinds of memory helps is actually a sign of good attentiveness and an attention to safety. So we just need to be aware that those things do decline with age, and whatever help we can get in the cockpit by writing things down or enlisting the aid of our passengers and family members is going to help the situation.
Well, someone said to me just a year or two ago, "You're not a pilot unless you have a pen." And I thought that was really kind of clever. And I will add to that, you're not a pilot unless you have two pens. I dropped one on the floor just a day or two ago, and I couldn't reach it. And I just went into my pocket and I pulled out my backup pen. So I routinely have 2 or 3 pens in my pocket because I find them so essential when I'm teaching, because I'm often taking notes. And I think one of the things that really differentiates safety between GA pilots and commercial pilots is the 2-pilot crew. I find there are many times when I'm flying when one or the other of us isn't quite sure what was that altitude, what was that frequency. It's wonderful having the second pilot there. I'm sure that explains part of why 2-pilot crews are safer. So definitely bring another pilot along with you more often as you age. Now tell us about decision making and proficiency. How do they change as we get older?
The things that happen automatically when we're younger, now as we're older, take a little more attention. And those things that happen automatically now may need some prompting, and using things like checklists or routines that are repetitive are helpful. But in general, slowing things down, taking a little more time to do the pre-flight, and thinking about things before you do them will help with those sort of things. And having alternative plans, the what ifs, and thinking those things through ahead of time so that decisions have more time to be made and more options can be considered. And we should be more organized in our approach to thinking and training and to doing things the same way over and over again. And I think that's one of the things that I've learned by observing and talking with airline crews. When I watch videos of airline crews doing things, they do things the same way over and over every time. And that will help. And it will help with not only maintaining and improving proficiency, but it can also help to overcome things like memory items, like, did I remember to do that particular thing on the walk around? Or have I checked all these things? And so doing things by routine, doing things with checklists, and not being in a hurry is a better way to make good decisions and to remain proficient. And I think as we get older, that's important for any pilot of any age. But as we get older, it becomes more important in order to prevent some of these lapses and gaps and memory losses that occur.
Yes, I always want to make sure that I've got a plan B. And I think those standard operating procedures are so helpful because it becomes clear to us when we've forgotten something, if something doesn't feel right, if we do things the same way every time. Talk about the benefits of getting new ratings and things like that to keep your mind active.
Yeah, I taught medical students and residents and fellows for 35 years. And I used to tell those people I was training, these are medical people, I used to tell them the brain is a muscle and the brain has to be exercised like any muscle. And if you don't use your brain regularly, it will atrophy and it will not serve you as well. And so one of the things that we older pilots can do that really, really helps is to take on new challenges. Studies of aging individuals and studies of things like cognitive decline and dementia suggest that older individuals who do intellectually challenging things like learning a new skill like playing bridge or learning how to play a musical instrument or learning a new foreign language, those sorts of mental exercises are exercising the brain as a muscle. So getting a new rating, if you've got a private certificate, think about doing that commercial certificate and learning those commercial maneuvers. I became a flight instructor after almost 40 years of flying at age 67. And I can tell you it was a bit challenging to go through the training to become a flight instructor, but I think it improved my flying in many, many aspects because it challenged me to read and to learn something new. So getting a new rating, learning a new skill, learning a new kind of an airplane. If you've always flown tricycle gear airplanes, learn how to fly a tail dragger. Learn something new. Go to different airports. Take along someone, either an accomplished CFI or an accomplished senior pilot, and go do things that you hadn't done before. I took a flight in my Cirrus to California 10 years ago and picked up a seasoned mountain instructor in Fort Collins, Colorado. And we had a delightful 3 days doing something I had never done before. And that was flying at the high altitude airports in Colorado and Nevada and Utah. And it was not something I would have done by myself, but to do it with an accomplished instructor, it really expanded my knowledge. It forced me to read about things that I hadn't really paid much attention to before, like mountain waves and density altitude and all sorts of things that are common to those who routinely fly in the mountains. But those kinds of experiences, taking on a new challenge, learning a new equipment, learning a new flight management system. Many pilots now are having their older panels upgraded. And that whole process of new avionics and a new autopilot and new flight routines with proper guidance and instruction from instructors who know about those things can be a wonderful way to maintain and improve proficiency and to really keep sharp and to try to stave off that predictable decline in proficiency that occurs if we just do the same old things the same way over and over again. Flying the same flights to the same airports every day or every week, or it just won't be as effective as taking on new challenges of new ratings or new equipment.
Let's talk about how pilots can scale back their flying to match their declining capabilities. I worked with a lady who, when I gave her last flight review that I gave her, she was 92. She, I
Hmm.
thought, had chosen a rather remarkable path to downsize. At some point in her life, she decided to give up instrument flying. Later on in her life, she decided to give up night flying. And then toward the very end, she decided to stop flying solo. She would always bring another pilot along with her. She also had the benefit of flying the same Cessna 182 that she'd had for 48 years, and she was a flight instructor. But I thought that really was just a brilliant way to kind of gracefully right size what we're doing as we fly. Talk a little bit about that and what pilots should be thinking about in terms of that when they get older.
Yeah, so the demands of flying as we get older will begin to seem a little greater than when we were younger. And so those pilots who are flying larger, faster, complex airplanes may want to consider moving from a complex airplane with retractable gear to something that's a little slower with fixed gear. Or the pilot of the twin may think that, well, maybe it's time to move and go to a little simpler single engine airplane, or the high performance pilot who flies in the flight levels with turbine equipment may decide that it's time to plan for shorter cross country legs, shorter flights overall. And I like your suggestion, Max, of flying with the buddy system. My experience at night is not insignificant, but I don't have as much night experience as I have day experience. So when I became a flight instructor and wanted to improve my proficiency at night, I have a friend who's an airline captain. He flies for one of the major carriers, and he agreed to come with me. And in those cold, clear, dark Pennsylvania nights, we had a great time flying to multiple airports in the dark, and improved my proficiency and just gave me a great sense of comfort and reassurance that I had a very seasoned former Air Force pilot, now a captain for a major airline, with me. So doing those kinds of things is part of right sizing. I think it's important that we take on new challenges and get new experiences, but we want to do that in a way that's safe. And so flying with another pilot, flying with somebody who has experience in things that you don't have, somebody that can function almost like a first officer as a check and as a reminder, as a second set of eyes and ears. That's a very, very important way. And it means we can continue to fly as we get older. We just have to reframe it, recognize these losses of abilities and function that we've been talking about, and take steps to accommodate those things. And it doesn't mean that we have to stop flying. It just means that we have to fly in a different way. And another thing we need to do as we get older is to probably fly more frequently with flight instructors who can assess and evaluate how we're doing and can point out to us the things that might be deficient that we may not be able to recognize on our own. And having an instructor see those things and gently point out to us where we could use some additional practice or improvement, or perhaps even things that we should stop doing. And I think that's very, very important that we have, probably as we age, more frequent assessments, either by another pilot, a colleague, a friend who can fly with us and give us some feedback as to how we're doing, or that we do things like our flight reviews and our instrument proficiency checks more often and have a CFI evaluate us, give us feedback, and ask us how we think we're doing, and ask us to point out as pilots whether we think there's areas that we're just not as proficient or as competent as we used to be. And those instructors can then help us to reframe and rethink and so-called right size our flying, and perhaps eliminate things that we should no longer be doing.
I know you've given presentations in the past in which you talked about how to conduct an effective flight review, what people used to call the BFR. Do you want to elaborate on that for a moment?
Yeah, I think these are very, very important to do. And, I'm of the mind, and I hope it's not because I'm now biased as a flight instructor and I want to see people fly with me more often, but I really think the biennial review is not terribly useful. I think we all ought to be having annual reviews. And I'll remind us that our airline colleagues who fly, 20 days a month have reviews in simulators every 6 months or every 9 months. They do it more frequently than we do, and they fly much more than we fly. So I think, first of all, those reviews, whether it's an instrument proficiency check or a flight review, should be done more frequently. And when it's done, we who are flight instructors should use Advisory Circular 6198 Charlie, which is the FAA's guidance on flight reviews and instrument proficiency checks. And that document contains very useful checklists for both the pilot and the CFI on the things that should be reviewed. And there's a lot of writing in the general aviation literature from senior flight instructors who talk about the so-called pro forma flight review, where it's a quick hour on the ground and an hour in the air that meets the regulations, but really doesn't accomplish anything. And what we need to do when we do flight reviews is we need to really assess, particularly in the older pilot, how competent are they in terms of their pre-flight planning, their decision making, their ability to acquire weather information, their ability to make go, no-go decisions, their ability to understand the equipment they're going to use and its limitations. And then review with them things like the aviation regulations, which may have faded from their memory, and make that ground preparation that's required for the flight review be meaningful. And then in the airplane, don't just go and do 3 takeoffs and landings and call it a flight review, but do things that they haven't done for a while that can really help assess proficiency. And if they've got an old commercial rating and they haven't done commercial flight maneuvers in a long time, have them do those things. For the private pilot, when's the last time they did slow flight or stalls or steep turns? And I think we should have this notion as we get older that one of the things that will help us remain proficient is to continually challenge ourselves. And one of those challenges can come every time we do an instrument proficiency check or a flight review. And then after we've done the review, we should have with the flight instructor a very accurate post-flight assessment. We should sit down, we instructors should sit and pilots should sit with instructors, and we should do a briefing after the flight that asks, well, how did things go? What did the pilot think of the flight? Ask the pilot to replay with their own words the flight in their mind and to reconstruct the flight and answer the woulda, coulda, shoulda questions. What could she have done better? What could she have done differently? How could the flight review have been different? And then reflect on what they learned and what things were easy, what things made them uncomfortable, and what do they think about their performance. And then after having done all that, ask the pilot, and the CFI should focus on, well, what do you think we could learn today that we could use to keep our future flights safe? And what could we use that we've learned today to apply to future flights? So the flight review should be a very dynamic opportunity for learning, opportunity for creativity, for objective assessment, and should then lead to a design by the pilot of a proficiency plan. What does the pilot have to do to maintain their proficiency? And as we get older, does that mean we have to change things like our personal minimums? Do we need to readjust what sort of weather we're willing to tackle as an instrument pilot? What times of day are we willing to fly? What should we think about in terms of the length of our flights and so forth. And if we've never been to environments like I just mentioned, if we've not had any mountain flying experience or high density altitude experience, should we either plan to avoid those things or develop a plan where we can learn new skills? So I think that's how we need to approach our aging. And if we do those things, and if we focus our flight reviews and we have a plan to maintain currency and improve proficiency, then I think even as we age, we can continue to fly safely and fly for a very long time.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is pilots, after you've been flying with a flight instructor, take some notes. I used to do this for years, especially when I was working on new ratings. I've also flown with other pilots who every time they would fly with me, they would reflect afterwards the conversation we'd had on the post-flight briefing. They'd go home, they would type up a few notes, and then they would review those before the next flight. So I think that's a really effective way for people to kind of crystallize the knowledge that they may have picked up. Because I think a lot of these insights that we pick up are very transient. And so unless you document them in some way, you may just be learning the same thing again the next time you fly. And I think it just makes a heck of a lot of sense to review what we learned on each flight so that we're not relearning the same thing each time.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent suggestion. And it also helps then to develop that working plan of how we're going to maintain and improve our proficiency. I think note taking is an excellent strategy for doing that.
So I was wondering, I think a big challenge that any of us who know pilots have is figuring out how to have the conversation with them when we see them perhaps starting to fly beyond their ability. I've heard stories locally of, the pilot who started becoming, forgetful and didn't remove the chain when he was getting ready to taxi, or, things like that were just kind of signposts that said, this person is no longer as skillful, and, maybe they should be scaling back their activities in some ways. Now, this is probably similar to the classic problem of how does the family get grandpa to stop driving, or at least to scale back his driving. What are your thoughts about how we have these conversations with pilots in our lives?
Well, it's very similar to the challenges we have in clinical medicine when we have to talk to people about uncomfortable topics. I was a medical oncologist for many, many years, and I occasionally had to talk about people whose cancers were progressing and whose treatment was effective for a time, but was no longer effective. And we had to sit and have some very difficult conversations. And what I learned from doing that is that you want to give the pilot, I won't say patient, in the past it was my patients, but want to give the pilot the opportunity to voice their concerns. Because very often they're aware, an older pilot is aware that they've had a decline in some of their ability, and they've had physiologic declines or performance declines. And very often they're simply waiting for someone to ask, is there something I can help you with? Or are there things that are troublesome to you about your flying, things that you find more difficult? And then what we need to do is to offer alternatives. Whenever people are faced with difficult clinical situations, what we learn in medicine is that we need to offer options and opportunities. And even if those options are not completely desirable or completely what one wants to hear, if there are options, then a patient still has choices. Well, the same is true of pilots. And we might say to a pilot, would it be reasonable to consider not flying at night? Or is flying your twin engine airplane becoming more of a challenge? And is it time to think about flying in a single engine airplane and doing flights of shorter distance and shorter duration? And the other thing is to get older pilots together with other older pilots to share similar observations and experiences and recognition of some decline in function. So that if you can bring pilots together and and share these concerns, because very often our concern is that, oh, I'm the only one that's experiencing these problems. I'm the only one that has vision problems or hearing problems, or I'm the only one that gets fatigued after a 3-hour flight. And then when you hear from other pilots of similar age that they're having the same experience, that can be very reassuring, and it can lead to partnerships and activities that can help. So I think when we see things that are a concern, when we hear poor radio technique or older pilots are doing things in the traffic pattern that are not by regulation or decline safe performance, then we can offer the opportunity to help rather than criticize, rather than to point fingers, but to invite them to a conversation that allows them to explore how we could keep them flying and how we could keep them flying safely.
Well, as we start to wrap up here, first, thanks so much for sharing your insights on aging and pilots and what we need to be doing differently. Can you tell us where people can find out more about you and your work and about the charity you founded, the Susquehanna STEM to the Skies?
Yeah, Susquehanna STEM to the Skies is a 501c3 public charity, and our mission is to improve STEM education in both the high schools and middle schools. And now increasingly, I'm being approached by the career technical centers, what I used to call VOTEC schools, vocational technical schools when I was in school, but now they're called career technical centers. And we provide learning experiences and exposure to aviation as an employment opportunity, not just for pilots, but for mechanics and air traffic controllers and dispatchers and avionics technicians. And we're trying to address this looming need that we have for tens of thousands of pilots and mechanics and air traffic controllers that are coming as we older folks are aging and retiring. And so Susquehanna STEM to the Skies is based here in central Pennsylvania, and we are an outreach program that brings in groups. We just did a 2-week aviation STEM camp with one of our local career technical centers. We have a local high school that has adopted the AOPA STEM curriculum, and we're trying to facilitate all of those kinds of activities. So it's a bit ironic that we're talking about the aging pilot today, and much of my focus these days is on students 12 to 18 years of age. But it's a delightful thing, and it's actually something that's revitalized and re-energized me. There's nothing like hanging around a bunch of 12-year-olds to make you feel a little more youthful. And we have a website, susquehannastemtotheskies.org, that we're improving and expanding all the time. But that's something that keeps us busy. And we're also enlisting our senior pilots at our airport to help us with those activities and those programs. So it's good for everyone. It's good for the youngsters, it's good for the profession, and it's good for us older pilots.
And I'll include a link to that website in our show notes. Victor, thank you so much for joining us here again today.
It is always a pleasure, Max. I enjoyed talking with you.
And my thanks to Dr. Victor Vogel for joining us to talk about aging. I've included links to a Susquehanna STEM to the Skies charity and to NAFI in our show notes. And if you've learned something from the show, please take just 1 or 2 minutes right now to sign up and become a member of the club to support the show. I know you've been thinking about doing it. Maybe you haven't got around to do it. Now's a really great time to do it. To make a monthly donation, go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, which takes you to our Patreon site where you can see all the goodies you get when you sign up to support the show at various dollar levels per month. Or if you'd like to make a one-time donation, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, use your credit card or PayPal account to make a one-time donation. And of course, links to both of those sites are in our show notes, which you can always find at aviationnewstalk.com. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.